The boutique buzzed with energy, camera flashes bouncing off shimmering walls lined with the newest high-end handbags. Well-dressed guests clustered near the velvet rope barriers, each person adjusting their polished looks, eager to be seen. In the middle of the crowd, Claire Miller stepped through the entrance, her simple jeans and worn-out leather purse making her look almost invisible against the glittering sea of designer labels. She walked slowly, politely smiling at those who glanced her way, unaware, or maybe too used to, the way conversations softened and eyes sharpened at her appearance. Near the display for the latest collection, two young women dressed head to toe in luxury brands, Tiffany and Brooke, paused, mid-sip of their champagne. Tiffany's manicured hand barely covered her smirk as she nudged Brooke, tilting her head toward Claire. Brooke didn't bother to lower her voice. "Oh my God, someone tell Grandma the 90s called and wants their bag back." Her words sliced through the murmur of conversation, landing squarely in Claire's ears. A few nearby guests chuckled, softly, throwing Claire the kind of glances people reserved for a stain on a new carpet. Claire's cheeks flushed for half a second, but she didn't falter. She simply pulled her shoulders back, tightened her grip on her old leather purse, and moved calmly toward the main display. The air was thick with expensive perfume and polite judgment, but Claire walked through it as if it didn't touch her, the soft clink of her modest boots against the marble floor almost swallowed by the crowd. A sales assistant near the new collection caught sight of Claire approaching. Dressed in a sleek black suit, the assistant instinctively gave her a quick once-over, her smile thinning. Claire offered a warm greeting anyway, her voice soft but genuine. "Hi, these designs are beautiful. Can you tell me about the craftsmanship on this piece?" she asked, running her fingers lightly over the stitching of an elegant handbag. The assistant hesitated, her gaze flickering to Claire's old purse, then back to her face with mild disinterest. She answered curtly, rattling off a rehearsed line about imported Italian leather without much enthusiasm. Claire listened carefully, nodding appreciatively, asking another question that showed she truly understood the details most people overlooked, the hand-stitching, the balance of design and utility. But the assistant's attention had already drifted toward a couple dressed in designer suits entering from the other side. Unbothered, Claire let her fingers trace the fine stitching on the new bags, her mind wandering somewhere else for a moment. She moved gently among the displays, taking her time, savoring the artistry in a way few guests genuinely seemed to. The heavy chatter around her was a mix of sharp laughter, clinking glasses, and shallow compliments tossed back and forth like expensive confetti. Brooke and Tiffany passed behind her again, this time making no effort to hide their commentary. "Bet she's here for the free champagne," Tiffany muttered, loud enough for Claire to catch every word. Claire paused for a heartbeat, then turned slightly, offering them a brief, soft smile that somehow carried more dignity than any designer label could bestow. Nearby, a young girl no more than 8 tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed at Claire's bag. "Mommy, I like her bag. It looks real." Her mother, red-faced, quickly hushed her and steered her toward another display, but not before Claire caught the small, innocent truth in the girl's words. She smiled to herself, feeling a pang of gratitude amidst the quiet mockery. A sudden ripple of excitement moved through the room. Claire glanced up to see boutique staff setting up a small stage near the back wall. A shiny plaque had been unveiled, the gold lettering catching the spotlight. "Celebrating Legacy Designers 1. Night only." Her steps slowed, the noise of the crowd fading into a gentle hum as she read the words carefully. Claire's hand automatically moved to her shoulder strap, tightening her hold on her old weathered purse. She moved closer, weaving between clusters of guests without drawing much attention. In front of the plaque stood a series of vintage pieces, encased in glass, early designs from names that now ruled the industry. Claire leaned in slightly, her reflection merging with the faded handbags displayed inside. Some pieces looked eerily familiar, crafted with the kind of care and heart she recognized instantly. Her fingers brushed the edge of her own bag again, her throat tightening slightly. It wasn't just an old purse to her. It was memory, legacy, and love stitched into leather. A gift from her mother, one of the last before she passed. Claire blinked once, steadying herself. The boutique around her pulsed with shallow glamour, but inside Claire, something far richer stirred quietly. Behind her, Brooke's laughter rang out again, but Claire barely heard it now. Her eyes were locked on the name beneath one of the displayed pieces. A familiar name, a name tied to memories of childhood afternoons spent listening to her mother talk about the dreams she had once dared to chase. She felt a strange, weighty sensation in her chest, a kind of bittersweet recognition. The world around her moved on, shallow conversations swirling like empty leaves in a polished room. Claire took a quiet breath, squared her shoulders again, and turned back toward the crowd, her worn purse hanging proudly at her side as she stepped forward into the center of the dazzling, indifferent storm. A sudden chime rang through the boutique, soft at first, then growing louder as an announcement echoed across the high ceilings. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the event tonight, the legendary designer Mr. Leonardo Vance." The murmurs around the room sharpened instantly into an excited buzz. Guests adjusted their postures, some smoothing down their outfits, others grabbing their glasses for a casual but strategic pose. The room, once a shallow tide of conversations and sidelong glances, now surged with a new energy. Everyone wanted to be seen. Everyone wanted to be noticed by the man who built dreams from fabric and leather. Tiffany's eyes widened, and without a second's hesitation, she grabbed Brooke's hand and pulled her toward the center of the room, where the spotlight would likely fall. In their hurry, they brushed hard against Claire, shoving her slightly off balance. Brooke leaned close enough to sneer under her breath. "Careful, you might scuff the designer floor with that antique." The laughter between them was low but sharp enough to cut. Claire caught her footing, her heart giving a small jolt, not from anger, but from the suddenness of it. She glanced after them, their designer heels clicking arrogantly across the floor. Without a word, Claire stepped back, her hand gripping the old leather strap of her purse just a little tighter. It wasn't rage that filled her. It was a simple, firm refusal to let them dictate her worth. She shifted her weight, standing quietly by one of the side displays, blending into the crowd once again. The room buzzed louder, everyone craning, their necks toward the grand staircase where Leonardo Vance was expected to appear. Claire adjusted the strap of her purse again, smoothing a hand over the worn leather lovingly, the same way someone might adjust an old family photograph on a mantel. A small hand tugged at the edge of Claire's sweater. She turned to find a young girl, no older than 8, standing beside her, her wide brown eyes staring up at the old purse. "Mommy, I like her bag," the girl said in a sweet, clear voice that somehow carried just far enough for others nearby to hear. "It looks real, not fake like the shiny ones." The girl's mother gasped softly and gave Claire an apologetic smile, quickly ushering her daughter away with whispered scolding. But Claire knelt down to the girl's level for a brief second, her expression gentle, her voice warm. "Thank you," she said simply, her hand brushing lightly over the girl's tiny fingers. It wasn't dramatic or loud, just two people, one small and one grown, recognizing something true in a room full of surfaces. Standing again, Claire adjusted her posture, breathing in deeply. Around her, the crowd pressed closer toward the staircase, cell phones angled high. Someone spilled a drink nearby and cursed under their breath, but the room hardly noticed. All eyes were on the polished, marbled entrance, and then he appeared. Leonardo Vance descended the stairs, flanked by boutique staff and flashing cameras. He was taller than most had imagined, with silver streaks through his thick dark hair and a kind of ease in his step that couldn't be bought or faked. His presence commanded the room without needing to raise a hand or a voice. As Leonardo moved among the crowd, exchanging nods and brief handshakes, guests straightened like sunflowers tilting toward the light. Claire watched quietly from her spot near the side, her hand still resting on her old bag, feeling both very small and strangely calm. She had not come here looking for recognition. She had come because something in the boutique's invitation, the celebration of legacy designers, had called to a part of her she hadn't touched in years. Leonardo's eyes scanned the crowd politely, the kind of cursory glance any celebrity might offer their audience. Until suddenly, he stopped. Mid-step, mid-handshake, he paused, his gaze locked on Claire. More specifically, on the old, worn-out leather purse slung over her shoulder. A ripple passed through the crowd as people noticed his distraction. Conversations halted awkwardly, champagne glasses lowered. Tiffany and Brooke, standing just a few feet ahead, looked over their shoulders to follow his line of sight. Confusion briefly flashing across their carefully made-up faces. Leonardo's expression shifted slightly, a glimmer of recognition softening his strong features. Without hesitating, he began moving through the crowd, not toward the flashiest dress or the boldest jewelry, but toward the woman standing quietly in the corner, clutching a piece of worn leather against a sea of polished excess. Claire froze. For just a moment, her heart thudding louder than the soft lounge music playing in the background. She did not move, did not step back or forward. She simply stood there, still and small, as the storm of attention around her began to swirl. Leonardo approached with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something closer to reverence. The guests parted reluctantly, their eyes darting between Claire and the famous designer. For the first time that evening, Claire was not invisible. She was a question hanging in the air, unanswered, pulling all the attention that cheap glamour had tried and failed to command. Leonardo stopped, just a breath away from her, his hand gesturing gently toward the purse. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rich and warm, not loud but effortlessly carrying through the stunned silence, "but may I see that bag?" Claire, still gripping the strap, hesitated for just a fraction of a second before nodding and carefully slipping the purse from her shoulder. As she handed it to him, a hush fell over the entire boutique. Cameras lowered. Phones stopped clicking. Even Tiffany and Brooke stared in stunned silence. Leonardo turned the purse over slowly in his hands, his thumb tracing the stitching, the creases, the marks of time that no modern polish could imitate. His mouth tilted upward into a slow, genuine smile. He looked back at Claire, holding the purse carefully, almost tenderly. "I haven't seen this piece in decades," he said, awe clear in his voice. "You kept it." Claire blinked, unsure whether to speak, but something deep inside her understood what this moment meant, not just for her, but for the story stitched into every worn thread of that bag. The boutique seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Leonardo Vance didn't hesitate as he stepped closer, through the sea of luxury fabrics and clinking glasses. Camera flashes went off around him, eager to catch the moment, but he didn't so much as blink. His focus was locked on Claire, more precisely on the old leather purse she clutched against her side. Guests moved back instinctively, murmurs rising like a tide against the boutique's high marble walls. Claire stood frozen, the purse's familiar weight grounding her as the world around her spun faster than she could process. Tiffany's lips parted slightly in confusion, the sleek clutch in her hand now feeling awkward and meaningless. Brooke's perfectly painted nails dug lightly into the arm of her friend's gown as she whispered something sharp under her breath, but neither dared step forward. It was as if an invisible wall had gone up between them and the center of attention, and Claire stood squarely at its heart. Leonardo stopped just a foot away, his tall frame blocking out the lights, the polished glamour of the boutique fading around them. For a moment, he said nothing. His eyes, deep and thoughtful, remained fixed on the worn purse that had no place among the glossy perfection that filled the room. He finally spoke, his voice low but warm, carrying easily over the thick silence. "Excuse me," he said, his words slow and deliberate, as if he didn't want to break the spell. "But may I see your bag?" Claire blinked, her breath catching lightly. For a split second, her instincts told her to shield it, to protect the memory it carried. But something in Leonardo's tone, something genuine and deeply human, made her loosen her grip. Wordlessly, she slipped the strap from her shoulder and extended the purse toward him. Leonardo took it gently, cradling the old bag as if it were made of glass. His hands, famous for creating dreams stitched in silk and leather, now traced the familiar curves and seams of a relic from his own past. His expression shifted as he turned the bag over carefully, reverently, examining every worn edge, every softened crease. It was the face of a man who had stumbled upon something precious he thought had been lost to time. "I haven't seen this piece in years," Leonardo said quietly, his fingers brushing over the small, almost hidden signature stitched into the lining. His voice thickened slightly, heavy with memories only he knew. "This was one of my first handmade designs, back when every stitch mattered more than the name attached to it." He looked up at Claire, a soft smile curving his lips. "You kept it perfectly." Around them, a wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. The realization hit the guests like a sudden storm. Whispers flew from mouth to mouth about the authenticity, about the history, about the sheer rarity of what Claire had casually brought into their polished, shallow world. Some women instinctively clutched their new bags closer, as if fearful they had chosen the wrong trophies. Others stared openly, their faces cycling through shock, envy, and grudging admiration. Tiffany's hand jerked in surprise, her expensive clutch slipping from her fingers and landing with a soft, embarrassing thud on the polished floor. A few heads turned at the sound, but nobody reached down to help her. She stooped quickly, cheeks flushed, scooping up her overpriced handbag that now seemed laughably new, laughably common. Brooke pulled her away slightly, whispering frantically, but Tiffany's wide eyes remained locked on Claire, the woman she had mocked, shoved aside, laughed at, now standing beside Leonardo Vance himself, not by invitation, not by wealth, but by something neither of them had understood. Legacy. Leonardo turned the purse over one last time before cradling it close to his chest, almost like a returning piece of himself. He addressed Claire again, his voice a little lighter but no less sincere. "Would you allow me to showcase this tonight?" he asked. "It's more than just a bag. It's a part of a story that should be remembered." Claire, overwhelmed, but trying not to show it, found her voice. It came out smaller than intended, but steady. "Of course," she said simply, because there was no ego in her, no sense of possession, only gratitude. The boutique, the cameras, the judgmental glances, all of it faded into a muted background hum as Leonardo smiled at her, a smile not reserved for celebrities or socialites, but for a person who had carried a piece of his heart for decades without even knowing it. Photographers, sensing the significance of the moment, edged closer, their cameras clicking in a more respectful rhythm now. Claire's old leather purse, weathered and worn, became the centerpiece of the evening, eclipsing every new design, every flashy gown, every practiced pose. And Claire, standing quietly with her hands folded calmly in front of her, didn't need glitter or lights or validation anymore. The truth she carried had finally been seen. The boutique buzzed anew, but this time it wasn't mockery that filled the air. It was awe. Leonardo held the purse with a kind of reverence few understood, his thumb brushing over the softened leather, feeling the years written into every crease. The air between him and Claire hummed with something unspoken, something larger than the boutique walls or the flashing cameras could contain. Guests watched in silence, a strange mix of fascination and confusion painting their faces. He turned, slightly, shielding the purse from the noise of the room as he spoke directly to Claire, his voice low and sincere. "I would be honored if you'd allow me to feature this piece at tonight's final showcase. It's not just any bag, it's part of where I started, a part of who I was before the world started chasing names instead of stories." Claire's, hands now empty, felt suddenly cold. Her fingers twitched slightly, aching to reclaim the familiar weight of the purse. It wasn't vanity or stubbornness that made her hesitate. It was something deeper. That bag wasn't just old leather stitched into shape. It was a gift from her mother, given to her on the night of her high school graduation, a symbol of dreams passed from one woman to another. Her mother, who had worked 3 jobs and saved every penny just to buy something beautiful for her daughter. Her mother, whose hands had once run over that same leather, whispering, "Carry it with pride, Claire. It holds more than you know." The room seemed to narrow around her, the weight of memory pressing against her chest. For a brief moment she thought about saying no, about wrapping the purse back around her shoulder and disappearing into the cold, judgmental night. A soft scoff broke through her thoughts. A woman in a glittering gold dress leaned into her friend, not bothering to lower her voice. "It's just an old thing," she sneered. "Next they'll start selling antique junk as couture." Laughter, brittle and ugly, crackled around the room, like static. Claire's spine straightened without thought. She looked at Leonardo, still waiting, still patient. She looked at the purse in his hands, the history it carried, the craftsmanship it honored, and she thought of her mother, not in sadness, but in fierce, undiluted pride. "If you tell its story," Claire said quietly, her voice carrying further than she expected, "then yes, you can feature it. But the real story, where it came from, what it means." Leonardo didn't hesitate. His face broke into a rare, genuine smile, something unguarded that softened the careful angles of his public persona. He nodded once solemnly. "Of course, the real story deserves to be told." A low murmur of surprise swept through the crowd. This wasn't the scripted glamour they had come for. It was something raw, real, and unpredictable, and they didn't know how to react to it. Leonardo gestured warmly for Claire to follow him, cradling the purse carefully, as if it were a sacred artifact. Claire hesitated for only a heartbeat before stepping into motion, her sneakers making a soft, steady sound against the marble as she crossed through the throng of glittering strangers. The boutique's lights dimmed slightly as staff hurried to prepare the stage for the final showcase. Claire could feel the heat of dozens of stares burning into her back, but she didn't falter. She wasn't here to be admired or judged. She was here because something she had loved, something she had protected quietly for years, was finally about to be seen for what it truly was. As they neared the stage, Leonardo turned slightly toward Claire, his voice dropping into a more private tone. "You remind me of why I started this," he said. "Before the fame, before the labels, before the world decided what was valuable." Claire smiled faintly, her nerves easing under the weight of the moment. For the first time tonight, she didn't feel like she was out of place. She felt rooted, as if somehow all the years, all the small humiliations, all the invisible burdens she had carried, had led to this unexpected, surreal moment. The stage lights blinked to life, casting a soft, golden glow over the velvet backdrop. Before we dive deeper into Claire's unforgettable moment, the boutique host's voice said warmly through the speakers, "Take a second to like and subscribe to our channel for more real emotional journeys like this." The crowd shifted slightly, the formal host's announcement blending into the rhythm of the evening, but Claire barely noticed. Her focus remained on the stage ahead, the purse now carefully placed on a pedestal where all could see. Leonardo stood beside her, not in front of her, not towering above her, but beside her, a silent signal to the crowd that this story was as important as any runway strut or polished campaign. The lights softened again, focusing on the small worn purse displayed under a glass dome. The room hushed, a different kind of reverence now filling the space. Not for price tags, not for newness, but for something far rarer: authenticity. Claire took a slow breath as Leonardo turned to the crowd and prepared to speak, her heart beating, steady and strong. She wasn't invisible anymore. She never had been. It had just taken the right moment and the right story to remind everyone what real beauty could look like. And in this moment she knew her mother would have been proud. Leonardo stepped forward into the soft pool of light, the old leather purse cradled with surprising tenderness against his side. His voice, deep and sure, filled the boutique without the need for a microphone. Guests, once shifting restlessly for the best angle or better champagne, now leaned in, drawn by something they couldn't quite define. Even the photographers paused, their cameras lowered, sensing that what was about to happen wasn't a typical runway speech. "I want to introduce you all," Leonardo began, his tone rich with emotion, "to something very special tonight." He glanced toward Claire, standing a step behind him, her hands folded quietly in front of her, her heart hammering in her chest. "This purse," he continued, lifting it slightly for the crowd to see, "is not just a piece of leather. It is not just an accessory or a name stitched into fabric. It is a story. It is history. It is why I fell in love with design before the world turned it into a numbers game." There was a soft murmur among the crowd, the atmosphere shifting, heavy with a curiosity that hadn't been there before. Leonardo turned his full attention to Claire, motioning her gently to stand beside him. "This," he said, his voice warm, "was one of the very first pieces I ever made, before I had a brand, before I had recognition. When it was just me, a sewing machine, and a dream." He paused, letting the words settle into the quiet. "Claire," he said clearly, "carried not just the bag, but the belief that craftsmanship, heart, and human connection still matter." For a heartbeat, the boutique was silent, suspended in a moment that belonged entirely to her. Then, like a wave breaking against a long, dry shore, the applause erupted. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping Claire had heard 1,000 times before at events like these. It was real. It was loud. It was emotional. Guests stood where they were, clapping hard, some even whistling, some exchanging looks of sheepish admiration. Tiffany and Brooke, once so smug and careless, clapped too, but their smiles were tight, their eyes flickering with regret and disbelief. The photographers snapped back into motion, cameras flashing furiously, but this time not aimed at the newest models or the flashiest jewels. Their lenses honed in on Claire, capturing the woman in simple jeans and an old purse who had somehow become the most important person in the room. Claire blinked against the sudden brightness, stunned by the sea of faces turned toward her. She wasn't a model draped in sponsorships or a celebrity paid to appear. She was just herself, standing there on her own 2 feet, carrying her history proudly in a place that had tried so hard to make her feel small. Leonardo wasn't finished. He stepped aside slightly, giving her space, making sure the cameras caught her clearly, not hidden, not minimized. "Tonight," he said firmly, "we are reminded that real beauty doesn't come with a price tag. It comes from the hands that craft, the stories that endure, and the hearts that remember." Another round of applause broke out, even louder this time. Claire caught sight of the boutique owner standing near the edge of the crowd, clapping with an almost apologetic fervor, as if trying to undo the cold welcome she had given earlier. Tiffany, desperate to recover, adjusted her designer clutch and whispered something to Brooke, then moved closer to the stage, pretending to be part of the inner circle. Brooke followed, their smiles plastic, their movements awkward in a way they probably hadn't felt since high school. A few other socialites mimicked them, edging closer to Claire, hoping for a picture, a handshake, anything to attach themselves to the moment now gilded with meaning. Claire saw them, but didn't react. She didn't need their approval anymore. She hadn't needed it when they laughed at her, and she certainly didn't need it now that they were clapping. Leonardo turned to Claire one last time, his voice softer now, but no less public. "Thank you," he said, the sincerity plain in every syllable, "for reminding this industry what real beauty looks like." Claire smiled, small but unshakable. She wasn't dazzled by the applause, nor overwhelmed by the flashes. She simply stood there, carrying the memory of her mother, the weight of real dreams, and the quiet power of knowing she had been right all along. The purse rested safely under the glass case now, displayed not as an antique, not as a fashion relic, but as something rare and priceless, a testament to love, craftsmanship, and unseen courage. The boutique which once had felt so cold and unreachable, now hummed with a different energy. People whispered her name, not mockingly, but with curiosity and admiration. They would remember this night not because of the glamorous displays or the glimmering gowns, but because an ordinary woman had walked in with an old purse and reminded them all that value isn't always new. Sometimes it's carried quietly for years, waiting for the world to finally see it. And tonight, the world had seen it. Backstage, away from the bright flashes and buzzing crowd, the atmosphere was quieter, softer, like the exhale after a long-held breath. Claire sat on a low velvet bench, the old leather purse resting gently in her lap. Her fingers moved slowly over the familiar seams, tracing every worn edge, every tiny imperfection that made it perfect. Across from her, Leonardo Vance crouched with a black fountain pen in his hand, the cap clicking softly as he removed it with care. He glanced up at her, a kind, private smile on his face, and then turned his attention to the inside flap of the purse. In a slow, deliberate hand he wrote, "To Claire, who kept the story alive." His signature flowed beneath the words, small and elegant, a quiet echo of everything the night had come to mean. Claire blinked quickly, the tears threatening to blur her vision, but she didn't wipe them away. They weren't the kind of tears she wanted to hide. They were the kind that rose up when something precious, long held quietly in the heart, was finally recognized by the world. Leonardo handed the purse back to her with both hands, as if returning a sacred object. "Thank you," he said again, his voice almost a whisper, as if louder words might shatter the fragile magic of the moment. Claire cradled the purse against her chest, nodding once, unable to find the right words. Maybe there weren't any. Maybe gratitude didn't always need to be spoken out loud. The soft tap of hesitant footsteps broke the stillness. Claire looked up to see Tiffany and Brooke approaching, their movements slower now, stripped of the careless confidence they wore like perfume earlier that evening. Brooke hung back slightly, glancing nervously at the fashion staff bustling around them. Tiffany, chewing lightly on her lower lip, stepped closer, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey, Tiffany began awkwardly, twisting the strap of her designer, clutch between her fingers. "We didn't realize, we didn't know who you were, or what that was." Claire watched them both for a moment, her heart surprisingly steady. She didn't feel the need to lash out or to savor any kind of petty revenge. She simply felt free. She stood, smoothing her hands over her jeans, the purse swinging lightly from her shoulder once again. She offered Tiffany and Brooke a small, polite smile. The kind of smile you give strangers who bump into you on the street. Not enemies, not friends. "Sometimes," Claire said gently, her voice clear and even, "you don't need a new label. You just need an old soul." Tiffany opened her mouth as if to respond, but Claire had already stepped past her, moving with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed anyone's permission to belong. The hallway backstage opened into a service corridor, where a single door led out to the side of the boutique. Claire pushed it open and stepped into the cool embrace of the New York evening. The city lights sparkled like 1,000 promises against the night sky, the distant hum of traffic weaving softly through the air. She stood for a moment, breathing it all in, the noise, the motion, the sheer aliveness of it all. Her reflection caught briefly in the boutique's tall window, simple jeans, worn sneakers, an old leather purse resting proudly on her shoulder. But tonight, she didn't see someone out of place. She saw someone who had carried her story with grace, someone who had protected the past even when the world rushed after the new, someone her mother would have looked at and said, "You were always enough." Claire smiled, this time not for anyone else, not to be polite, not to soften anyone's judgment. She smiled for herself. Adjusting the strap of her purse, she stepped away from the boutique and into the heart of the city, disappearing into the river of people who moved without needing spotlights or stages, carrying their unseen stories with them wherever they went. And as she walked, the purse, old, worn, beautiful, swung lightly at her side, catching the streetlight with every step. Several weeks later, A glossy magazine rested on the wooden table of a bustling downtown cafe, open to a 2-page spread. Across the top, bold, elegant letters declared, "The woman who reminded us why we fell in love with fashion." Beneath it, a photograph of Claire smiled back at the world, not airbrushed, not styled within an inch of her life, but real. She stood in simple jeans and her now famous worn leather purse slung over her shoulder, a soft confidence radiating from her eyes. Around her, the boutique's glimmering lights blurred into a background she no longer needed to compete with. The article told the story honestly, about legacy, about craftsmanship, about a woman who hadn't needed wealth or connections to prove value, about a forgotten bag that had once been handmade by a dreamer before fame arrived, and about a woman who had carried that dream quietly across years when no one was watching. Readers across the country poured in letters and comments, many admitting they had packed away old treasures or family heirlooms, a shame they weren't new enough, only to now see them differently. Claire's story had stirred something deeper than fashion. It had reminded them of roots, of memory, of pride. But Claire wasn't interested in walking red carpets or posing for the next big campaign. Her heart had other plans. In a small but sunny community center on the city's east side, Claire stood before a long table scattered with worn-out handbags, cracked leather jackets, broken straps, and faded zippers. Around her sat a handful of women of all ages, some single mothers, some students, some who had never owned anything labeled designer in their lives. They listened carefully as Claire showed them how to clean, restore, and reimagine the old pieces in front of them. No fancy tools, no expensive magic, just patience, a few basic materials, and the belief that something loved could always be beautiful again. Her hands moved confidently, demonstrating how a torn lining could be stitched back stronger, how faded leather could be conditioned into a soft, weathered richness that new bags tried, and often failed, to fake. Every repaired bag told a story. Every woman who fixed one found a little more belief in her own hands. Toward the back of the room, Claire spotted a familiar small face peeking shyly over the edge of a folding chair. Emma, the same little girl who had pointed at her old purse weeks ago in the boutique, sat beside her mother, her wide eyes following every movement Claire made. Claire's heart warmed instantly. She excused herself from the front table and crossed the room. Kneeling to Emma's height, she pulled something carefully wrapped in a soft cloth from her bag. When she unfolded it, Emma's face lit up with pure wonder. It was a small handmade purse, simple but sturdy, crafted with love and care from leftover scraps Claire had saved. Soft brown leather stitched with tiny, careful hands, a delicate pattern embossed on the front, and Emma's initials hidden inside just for her. "For you," Claire said softly, placing it into the girl's outstretched hands. Emma clutched it to her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Her mother's eyes glistened, and she mouthed a heartfelt thank you that Claire returned with a quiet nod. The room around them buzzed with new energy. Women laughing over mistakes, celebrating small victories when a stubborn tear gave way to a perfect stitch. No one was worried about trends or labels here. They were building something different, something stronger. As Claire stood and looked over the room, the old purse rested on the nearby counter, its story stitched invisibly into every lesson she passed on. It no longer needed a glass case or a magazine feature to prove its worth. It had done its work, and it was helping others find their own stories now. Outside the center, the city moved on as it always did, rushing, chasing, buying, discarding. But inside these walls, something slower, something better, had taken root. They had once mocked her for carrying an old purse, but what she had carried was history, dreams, and a heart the world had almost forgotten to honor. If you enjoyed Claire's journey, please like and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring true stories like this.